Thank you so much for tuning in to LearnLinuxTV, your source for Linux-related fun and learning. I love producing Linux-related content for you, but I can't do it alone. If the content on this channel has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting LearnLinuxTV. And one of the ways that you could do that is by becoming a patron, which will give you access to exclusive perks. Also, be sure to check out my latest book, Mastering Ubuntu Server 4th Edition. And while you're here, be sure to subscribe. New content is uploaded each and every week. Thank you so much for your support, I really appreciate it. Now, let's get started with today's video. I've always imagined that in the future we'd be able to have a single portable computer, and that device would be your everything. There would be no sacrifices in terms of battery life and portability, even when you have a GPU. On that computer, you could get your work done and play high-end games all from one single ultra-portable device. Today, that possibility is now a reality. With external GPUs, or eGPUs, you can absolutely achieve this. With an eGPU, you simply connect it anytime you want to play games, and then you disconnect it when your gaming session is over. So essentially, an eGPU can actually transform your non-gaming notebook into a gaming powerhouse. And the best part is that buying an eGPU is an easy, straightforward process that's not confusing at all. Actually, that last statement was completely untrue. eGPUs are a complete mess, and buying one and checking compatibility is very confusing and tedious. But thankfully, you have me, and what I'm going to do in today's video is demystify external GPUs. Hello and welcome back. In today's video, it's all about external GPUs, or more simply, eGPUs. And actually, I have my eGPU right there, and I'm going to talk about it in today's video, but not just mine. I'm going to give you all the information that you need to know in order to determine whether or not this is the right solution for you or even possible on your hardware. And that last statement is very important. You might think that just by having a Thunderbolt port that you have everything you need in order to utilize an eGPU, but unfortunately it's just not that simple. The thing is, the computing industry just seems to make everything way too complicated for some reason I can't really understand, so something as simple as plugging in a Thunderbolt cable ends up being way more complicated than it needs to be. So what I'm going to do in today's video is go through everything that you need to know in order to determine whether or not an eGPU is going to be a good solution for you in particular, and I'll also have time codes down below, so that way you can go right to the section that most interests you. In the next section, what I'll do is go over what an external GPU is in the first place and why you might want to consider one. After that, I'll go over the software and hardware requirements that are required in order to actually use an eGPU. In the section after that, I'll show you how to set up an eGPU, but keep in mind this is a Linux channel, so a lot of the footage that you're going to see will be captured from a Linux machine. However, I won't ignore other operating systems, so I'll give you some tips on non-Linux platforms as well. In addition to that, I'm going to show you guys some gameplay footage from an eGPU, and then at the end of the video, I'll give you my overall thoughts. And by the end of this video, you'll have all the information that you need to know in order to use an eGPU. So let's get started. First of all, what exactly is an external GPU or eGPU? Well, that term alone should probably be at least somewhat descriptive as far as what an eGPU allows you to do. It's an external GPU, so if you know what a GPU is, then just imagine it as the external version of that. But just in case you haven't heard of this concept before, let's define what an eGPU is and what exactly it allows you to do. Now, if you're a PC gamer, then you already know how important a good video card or a GPU is when it comes to playing games that are otherwise too demanding to perform well or even at all on integrated graphics. Most often, serious gamers will choose to build a high-end gaming rig into which they can install a powerful GPU, and then they get, all the frames and the best performance, and life is good. Another option, for at least some PC gamers, is to buy a high-end gaming notebook with a dedicated GPU inside. And both of those options are generally good, but with a dedicated gaming notebook, it's often the case that they're much heavier and have poor battery life when compared to ultra-portables that have neither of those issues. But what if you could have an ultra-portable notebook, but still use it to play high-end games? Well, that's the goal that eGPUs attempt to reach. With an eGPU, you simply connect it to your notebook and suddenly your device becomes a gaming desktop. Of course, it's important to adjust your expectations though. An eGPU simply cannot measure up to a dedicated gaming rig, especially considering that gaming motherboards have much higher bandwidth for the GPU to use. But still, you can get some pretty impressive results from an eGPU, so it might actually surprise you how good they can be. In addition, eGPUs can also serve as a docking solution as well, since they have all of the ports that your typical docking station might have, such as HDMI, DisplayPort, Ethernet, USB, and so on. So with that in mind, what this allows you to do is it gives you the ability to hook up your display, keyboard, mouse, and other accessories to the eGPU, and then it can transform your notebook into a full-powered desktop. And that sounds like a pretty cool thing, right? I mean, to me it sounds awesome. The concept of having an ultra-portable as your only computer and being able to transform that ultra-portable into a gaming desktop, that's pretty darn cool. But unfortunately, it's not really that simple, and it's possible that your computer might not even be able to support an eGPU even if you do have Thunderbolt. And the reason why that's the case is because, well, we have different versions of Thunderbolt and also alternate versions with a different number of PCIe lanes as well. So it's not enough to just check the box that you have access to Thunderbolt on your notebook. You may or may not be able to use an eGPU even with that because, well, when it comes to standards, I guess the computing industry just can't really seem to get anything right. I mean, at one point, when USB 3 came out, we basically achieved plug and play. Everything was plug and play. It was great. But ever since USB-C and then Thunderbolt and all of these other things came out, well, they made it confusing again, unfortunately. And what's worse is that companies don't seem to do a good job when it comes to educating consumers about the capabilities of the computers that they sell. So that's where I come in. And in the next section, what I'm going to do is outline the requirements of what you'll need in order to have a good experience with an eGPU. All right, so in this section, what I'm going to do is give you guys the details about what's required in order to support an eGPU. Now, even though this is a Linux-focused YouTube channel, nothing in this section actually requires or is specific to Linux. And the reason for that is because the majority of what I'm going to talk about is all about hardware requirements. And, well, when we're talking about hardware requirements, then the operating system doesn't matter. These are hardware requirements. So that's what we're going to go over. I'm going to let you guys know exactly what you need in hardware in order to use an eGPU. Now, the first hardware requirement that I'm going to go over, and this is probably the most obvious of all, is that your notebook must have a Thunderbolt port. If it doesn't, then, well, an eGPU is just not possible. So, in order to use an eGPU, you must be able to check the box that you have a Thunderbolt port, but unfortunately, it's not actually that simple when it comes to Thunderbolt because there's different types of Thunderbolt. Assuming your device has Thunderbolt support, let's look at the remaining requirements. And this is where things start to get weird, or at least a bit confusing. If your notebook actually has Thunderbolt, then it's going to have either version 1, version 2, 3, or 4. Basically, the higher the version of Thunderbolt that your notebook might have, the better. With higher versions of Thunderbolt, you'll benefit from faster performance and also some additional features as well. So again, the higher the version of Thunderbolt that you have, the better the experience that you might get. But if you have Thunderbolt on your device, do you even know what version it might be? I'll bet that most of you probably don't. And the reason for that is because device manufacturers, they don't often do a good job when it comes to letting you know which version of Thunderbolt your device might have. I mean, they'll probably have on the box something like Thunderbolt. It'll just say Thunderbolt to let you know that the device has a Thunderbolt port, but it probably doesn't say what version. At least on my end, I have yet to see any notebook manufacturer actually advertise that on the box. And other times, you just simply have a Thunderbolt sticker on the chassis to let you know that Thunderbolt exists, but that's usually about as much information as you'll get. So the thing is, in order to understand whether or not an eGPU can work on your computer, you will need to know which version of Thunderbolt that device has. Now, don't start Googling just yet, though. Later in the video, what I'll do is show you how to determine the version of Thunderbolt that your device has. But continuing with the requirements, when it comes to the Thunderbolt version, you're going to need at least Thunderbolt version 2. If your device has Thunderbolt 3 or 4, then that's even better, but it has to be at least Thunderbolt 2. But unfortunately, there's another layer to consider as well when it comes to Thunderbolt. It's not enough to understand that you do have Thunderbolt and that it has to be Thunderbolt 2 or greater. No, we need to add another confusing layer to the mix, and the other requirement is that you have to understand how many lanes your Thunderbolt version actually has. And yes, they have a different number of lanes, so it's not enough to understand what version of Thunderbolt you have. We have to add additional lanes as another variable that we have to contend with as well. And more specifically, in order for you to have a good experience with an eGPU, the Thunderbolt implementation on your notebook must have access to either 2 or 4 PCI Express lanes. Thunderbolt 3, for example, can have either 2 lanes or 4. And if you have access to 4 lanes with your Thunderbolt implementation, then that's great. 2 lanes is okay, but 4 is going to give you even greater performance. If your notebook features Thunderbolt 4, then in that case, you'll definitely have access to 4 lanes because that's a requirement for Thunderbolt 4. So if you have Thunderbolt 4, then pretty much every box is checked when it comes to the requirements of Thunderbolt, because Thunderbolt 4, at least as of the time I'm recording this video, is the latest and greatest and has the most capabilities. So, is this confusing you at all? Well, actually, what I decided to do was create a flowchart about checking the capabilities or the capabilities that are required. And I'm going to show you that flowchart here in just a moment, but I just want to mention that the fact that I even need to create a flowchart is very sad because a consumer shouldn't need to go through a flowchart in order to understand what their device is capable of. It should be obvious, but again, here we are, and the PC industry just can't seem to make anything easy. Anyway, let's take a look at that flowchart so you can see what I'm talking about. And here's the flowchart. Now, I wish I didn't need to make this flowchart. I wish this wasn't as confusing as it is, but hopefully this flowchart will help you guys understand whether or not you can expect to have a good or a bad experience with an eGPU. In addition to that, what I'm going to do is include this diagram in the official blog post for this video that you could check out. It will be linked below. And also from that blog post, you can access the community forums. So if you have a Linux specific question, because my forums are Linux specific, then you can access the forums and ask for guidance. First, we take a look at whether or not your device has Thunderbolt at all. If it doesn't, well, don't bother. You can't use an eGPU. If your device does have Thunderbolt, then, well, you move on to the next step. In that case, we need to check to see whether or not it's Thunderbolt 3. If it's not, well, don't bother. I mean, you can get an eGPU to work in that case, but you're not really going to get much of a benefit. If you do have Thunderbolt 3, then the next step is to determine how many lanes you have. Do you have at least 4 lanes? If you do, then you'll have access to the best possible performance that you can get from an eGPU. Now, if your implementation only has access to 2 lanes, then at best you can get a mediocre experience with an eGPU, but it's still going to be a lot better when compared to integrated graphics. But if you don't have at least 2 lanes, well, unfortunately, we go back to the don't bother section, and unfortunately, an eGPU is just not for you. So yeah, Thunderbolt is a bit confusing, but what I'm going to do is show you guys in the next section how to determine what the capabilities are of your device, so that way you'll know whether or not you have all of the Thunderbolt specific requirements that you'll need to have in order to use an eGPU. So in the previous section, what I did is I went over all of the requirements that you'll need to have in order to understand whether or not an eGPU is actually a possibility for you in particular. In this section, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that concept and show you guys how to tell exactly what your Thunderbolt capabilities are, so that way you'll definitely understand whether or not you'll have a good or a bad experience with an eGPU. Now, the first thing that I want to mention is that if you haven't already purchased a notebook, if you're in the market for a notebook, then which one should you buy? Well, here's the thing. If you go to eGPU.io, and I'll actually have a link in the description below, they'll actually have some information about Thunderbolt capabilities per machine. And even if you already have a notebook, you can still check this site and find out how many PCI Express lanes you have, your Thunderbolt version and whatnot, right from that site without needing to do anything else. So what I'll do is leave a link in the description below, and that link will go right to the notebook section of that website, which has a lot of information specific to individual devices as far as what the individual capabilities are of that device. But anyway, if you're in the market for purchasing a notebook, then that's a great resource to use to find out whether or not the notebook that you're thinking about buying will be a good fit if an eGPU is something that you want to benefit from. But with that website mention out of the way, let's go ahead and look at some operating system specific methods that you can use to determine the Thunderbolt capabilities of your device. So let's take a look at the process for checking a Windows system for Thunderbolt compatibility and also understanding what type of Thunderbolt you might have on your Windows system. Now, the easiest way that I've found to do this is to download the HW Info app, and I already have the web page for that app right here. So what we're going to do is download it. Now, I don't have any ad blockers or anything like that installed, and I decided not to install that just to prove a point here. There's some suspicious download links on the site, so just be sure to be careful regarding which link you click on to download this app. For example, right here, this is clearly a suspicious link right here, so we definitely don't want to click that one. But within the menu that's underneath that fake link, we should be able to find the real link to download the app. And what we'll do is click one of these underneath this menu here, so I'll just choose the first one. And what I'm going to do is just download the portable version of this application. That way I don't have to worry about any bundled installers or anything like that. So I'll just click on this. And it's already done. So what I'll do is right click on the downloaded application here and I will extract it. And here we have the application. So what I'll do is open up the Hardware Info 64 application. And then I'll click Start. Now a handful of other windows have opened up as part of the main application window here, and it's apparently offering me an update. I literally just downloaded this one, so either the website wasn't updated or I might have clicked on an older version, but it really doesn't matter because the only thing that we're interested in right now is the presence of Thunderbolt. And we could find that out through this application by first clicking on Bus. So let's expand that. And as you can see right here, we have several PCI Express root ports listed underneath the hardware for this notebook. And as an aside, the notebook that I'm recording this footage from is a ThinkPad T480S. So this is not the same notebook that I use for the majority of this video. I needed a Windows machine, and this is the first one that I could find. Anyway, what we could do is click on one of these root ports here. And already we can glean some very useful information regarding our Thunderbolt implementation on this notebook. And more specifically, we have Thunderbolt 3 on this notebook. We can see that underneath the version identifier. And we could also tell that we have 2 PCI Express lanes on this notebook. So unfortunately, with the T480S, this one in particular, we are not going to have the best experience with an eGPU. Now, to be fair, you can absolutely utilize a GPU with 2 PCI Express lanes, but again, you're not going to get the best experience, and in that case, it may not be worth it. The potential performance that you could get from this particular implementation with 2 PCI Express lanes is definitely better than integrated graphics, but then again, you are not going to get the same performance that you might get if you had 4 lanes available. But anyway, we were able to determine whether or not we have Thunderbolt support on this notebook, and we do. And we were also able to determine how many lanes we have available, in this case 2. So in the next section, what I'll do is show you guys the process when it comes to macOS to do the exact same thing. So I showed you just now a method for determining Thunderbolt compatibility on a Windows system. But what about those of you that use a Mac in addition to a PC? Well, let's take a look at the process on a MacBook. So what we're going to do is just go up here to the Apple logo. Next, we'll go down to About This Mac, which in my case is the first option here. And then on this window, what we'll do is click System Report. And then on the left-hand side of the screen, we have Thunderbolt/USB 4. So we'll click on that. And right here on this screen, you'll see all of the information that pertains to the Thunderbolt implementation on your particular Mac. Now, in my case, the footage that you're seeing right now is being taken from an M1 Mac, which are, unfortunately, incapable of supporting eGPUs. But anyway, I showed you how on a Mac to determine Thunderbolt compatibility, so using the information that I just gave you, you should be able to find out whether or not an eGPU is going to work on your particular Mac. So, given that information, you should be able to determine whether or not an eGPU is a possibility on your Mac. So let's take a look at the process in Linux for determining what your Thunderbolt capabilities are. So what we'll do is open up a terminal, and there's two commands that I'll show you. The first command is going to check whether or not you have Thunderbolt at all. If you already know that you do, then you don't need to run this. But if you don't know if you have Thunderbolt or not, then this command will actually let you know if you have that. And the command is sudo lspci-vv, and then we're going to pipe the output into grep-i, and we're going to grep for Thunderbolt. And actually, from this command, you should be able to tell which version of Thunderbolt you have as well, whether it's version 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, the next command will actually tell you how many PCI Express lanes that your Thunderbolt implementation has access to. If the results of the previous command show that you have Thunderbolt 4, then you don't really need to run this because you have access to 4 lanes. You already know the answer. That's actually a requirement for Thunderbolt 4. But if you don't have Thunderbolt 4, then you should definitely run this particular command right here. So we'll run sudo lspci-vv again, but this time we're going to pipe it into the grep command with the search term of lnksta, with the L and the S being capital. And by running that command, you'll understand exactly how many lanes you have. It'll actually show up as X2 or X4. X2 is more of a mediocre performance, but still better than integrated graphics. And then with 4 lanes, well, that's pretty darn good. You should definitely have a decent experience if you have 4 lanes available. So at this point, you should have all of the knowledge that you'll need to understand whether an eGPU is actually something that you can use. You should know which version of Thunderbolt you have, and also how many PCI Express lanes that it has access to. In the next section, what I'm going to do is go over what to buy. What should you actually purchase when it comes to an eGPU? Well, we'll cover that in the next section. So what should you buy? At this point, you understand that your device is more than capable of handling an eGPU, but which one should you actually buy? And also, which GPU should you buy? Well, that's exactly what we're going to cover in this section, so let's get into it. So which eGPU should you consider buying? Well, here on my end, I have the Razer Core X Chroma. But I'm not necessarily saying that that's the one that you should go with, it's just the one that I happen to have. What I recommend that you do is you go to eGPU.io. I mentioned that site earlier in the video, and there you could actually get reviews of individual eGPU models. And honestly, the content on that site is so great, I can't even compete with that. You definitely should go over there and check their reviews and follow their guidance as far as which one to buy. But I will be giving you some pointers in this section to help you guys make that decision. And the first one is to decide whether or not you want an eGPU that has a built-in GPU or one that's actually a GPU enclosure that you can actually install a GPU of your choice into. Now, the latter is the most common. The eGPUs that have built-in GPUs are much more rare, but they do exist. I recommend buying one that actually allows you to slot in your own video card because, well, the thing is, in that case, you can upgrade it. If it's built in, then you have to upgrade the entire eGPU, and I just don't think that's a good value. That's probably going to be more expensive in the long run. And that choice is just not going to be difficult to make anyway because the majority of eGPUs are eGPU enclosures, and you'll have to buy a GPU in order to place inside that enclosure to give you the complete experience. So then the question becomes, which GPU should you buy? If you don't already have one, it's actually a very important decision. And it's not enough to simply choose your favorite between AMD and Nvidia. I mean, yeah, that is a big part of the decision, but there's actually some additional trade-offs as well when you want to go ahead and use an eGPU. And those trade-offs have more to do with situations where you might actually use your eGPU with multiple operating systems. For example, if you have a MacBook in addition to a Linux notebook, then AMD is a win in both situations. macOS doesn't even support Nvidia eGPUs at all, at least not officially, so if you use macOS, then you should definitely go with AMD. And since that has a benefit on Linux as well, then overall AMD is the best choice if you mix between macOS and Linux systems. The reason why AMD is a better choice on Linux systems is because most Linux distributions have the AMD GPU driver built in, so literally there's nothing for you to install at all, and everything should just work out of the box. But not only that, the Linux community in general favors AMD because they're friendlier to Linux distributions anyway, so if you're using Linux and or macOS or a combination of both, then AMD is definitely the way to go. But then again, keep in mind that Nvidia has some benefits over AMD. For example, when it comes to video editing, if that's something that you do, you'll have an advantage if you use Nvidia. So in that case, you might actually have to go that direction. And when it comes to me, I prefer AMD GPUs as well, but the reason why I use Nvidia is because I have a YouTube channel, which of course means that I edit a lot of video. And like I mentioned, you're going to have a better experience when it comes to video editing with an Nvidia GPU. And when it comes to some video editors, there's definitely some bias towards Nvidia that really makes that work better. So even though I personally dislike Nvidia GPUs, I'm going to go with them just because of the fact that I edit video. So if you edit video as well, that might actually be a factor on your end. Now, if you don't already have an eGPU, then my recommendation is to buy one that is Thunderbolt 4 compatible. That's very important. Now, even if your notebook is only Thunderbolt 3, for example, then a Thunderbolt 4 dock is still the best way to go because it is backwards compatible. You'll still be able to use it, but you'll also have additional benefits with Thunderbolt 4 as well. And the thing is, you won't be able to use those additional benefits if you don't have Thunderbolt 4, but the thing is, if you later upgrade to a newer notebook and that one has Thunderbolt 4, then it's going to be great if your eGPU is already Thunderbolt 4 compatible. Then that means you'll be able to benefit from Thunderbolt 4 specific features without having to buy a new eGPU enclosure. So if you don't have an eGPU yet, definitely buy one that is Thunderbolt 4 enabled because that's just the best way to go and it's future-proof. So basically, go with an AMD GPU if you can, and a Thunderbolt 4 eGPU enclosure. That's the best way to go in that category. And the two of those things together should be fine. And also, of course, go with Nvidia if your use case requires you to do so. So hopefully the information that I went over in this section was enough to point you guys in the right direction as far as what to buy. Anyway, with that out of the way, in the next section, what I'm going to do is show you guys my overall experience when it comes to using an eGPU here in the studio. All right, so in this section, what I'm going to do is go over my personal experience with using an eGPU, which means you'll also see the workflow of setting one up. In addition to that, what I'm going to do is show you guys some gameplay examples. I'm going to show you a game running on integrated graphics and then that same game running on the eGPU. So let's go ahead and check it out. So first of all, a few notes about my setup. I already mentioned earlier in the video that I'm using the Razer Core X Chroma. That's the model of eGPU that I'm using. And inside it, I installed the Nvidia RTX 3070. It's not the best card available, but it's certainly not a bad one. The notebook in particular that I'm going to be using for these examples is the 8th Gen ThinkPad X1 Carbon. And on that notebook, I decided to install Ubuntu 2204. So that's the distro that I'll be using to show you guys all the examples in this section. However, the distribution shouldn't really matter so long as your distro makes the NVIDIA driver package available to you in the repositories and they also integrate it properly. But your mileage might vary from one distro to another. But for the most part, if your distribution is designed well, then you shouldn't have an issue using an eGPU at all and it should work out of the box. Now, when it comes to the test game that I decided to use for the examples, randomly, I decided to go with Portal 2. And even though that game is a bit old, it's definitely good enough to where we should be able to see a big difference in frame rate when I connect the eGPU. But before I go over how well that worked for me, there's a few disclaimers that I'll need to get out of the way first. And the first of those is that my screen capture device is presented to my notebook as a 4K display, So the resolution that I'm going to use is actually higher than what the internal display of this notebook is capable of. And because I'm driving essentially a 4K display, then the frame rate might be a bit lower than if my resolution was lower, but it is what it is. And the second of my disclaimers is that I disabled VSync in the settings for the game because I wanted the frame rate to go up as high as possible. But as a consequence of this, the footage will absolutely show clipping and lag. And those problems in particular are easily solved. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we have VSync. But I just wanted to mention that in case I get a bunch of comments letting me know that there's clipping and tearing. I'm fully aware of it, and I caused that to happen myself by making the decision to disable VSync. But again, I wanted the difference in frame rate to be clear, so that's why I decided to do that. Anyway, let's go ahead and see how the Razer Core X Chroma worked out on my end. First, I decided to run Portal 2 with no eGPU connected at all in order to get some sort of baseline for how well it runs with no acceleration. And honestly, it ran terribly. As you can see, the frame rate is very low. And because of that, the lag is so bad that playing this game was absolutely a tedious experience. I mean, even looking around had a lot of lag, even more so than what would be expected with VSync turned off. It was actually to the point where it was barely playable. But regardless, pay attention to the frame rate in the upper right-hand corner. As you can see, it's very low, but I'm going to use this as a comparison point to the eGPU. So it was clear to me that playing Portal 2, at least on this notebook, was not going to be a pleasant experience. So let's go ahead and see the process that I went through for setting up the eGPU. Before I connected the eGPU, I opened up the additional drivers app here in Ubuntu, and it showed that there are no drivers available. Everything is supported with this notebook out of the box in Ubuntu, so there's no drivers to install at all, which is great. After I connected the eGPU Thunderbolt cable to the Thunderbolt port of the notebook, I saw an icon appear briefly at the top right-hand corner of the screen while everything was connecting, and the presence of that icon in particular means that the eGPU or your Thunderbolt device is authorizing. After that was done, and it only took a few seconds, I went into the Settings app and under Privacy I checked to see whether or not the eGPU was fully detected. I also wanted to make sure that it was authorized, and as you can see here, it was. On your end, if it's not already authorized, you might have to authorize it yourself by confirming it, but that should be the most that you have to do for this step. After I verified that the eGPU was connected and recognized, I went back to the Additional Drivers app, and this time it showed an Nvidia driver being available. And since I installed an Nvidia GPU into my Razer Core X Chroma, that was a good sign. So I installed the newest driver available, and then I rebooted the computer. When the notebook came back up, it was time to finally try Portal 2 again, this time with the eGPU connected. And the experience was much smoother, as you can see. Of course, considering that I turned off VSync and my display isn't the greatest available, there's going to be some clipping and tearing. Like I mentioned earlier, those issues are easily solved, but I just wanted to see if I could get a higher frame rate, and I definitely did. I mean, look for yourself. At the top right-hand corner of the screen, we can see the frame rate, and it's definitely quite a bit higher than it was when I was just using integrated graphics. So Portal 2 was extremely playable, the frame rate was much higher, and the performance was actually decent. When I was done playing the game, I disconnected the eGPU, and my notebook was back to being just a notebook. So for me, when it comes to setting up an eGPU and playing Portal 2 while it's connected, it worked out pretty well. As you saw, it was a lot smoother. Now, in the next section, there's going to be a bit of errata and some tips, basically some things that didn't fit into their own section that I definitely want to go over. So I'll go ahead and meet you over in that section. So in this section, what I'm going to do is go over some additional details around eGPUs that didn't fit in the other sections earlier in the video. And also in this section, everything that I'm going to be going over is actually specific to Linux. So if Linux is not your OS, your daily driver OS, then, well, there's nothing here for you, and you can safely just stop watching the video right here. But if you are running Linux like me, then I recommend you continue because there's some additional details that I think are going to be important for you to know. And first, let's look at how you actually instruct an app to use the eGPU. When it comes to Portal 2, I didn't actually have to do anything at all. When I launched the game with the eGPU connected, it actually ran against the eGPU, and that was automatic, so I didn't actually have to do anything. But that's not going to be the case every time. Some apps might actually run against integrated graphics even when you have an eGPU connected. And if that's the case, how do you actually tell the app that you would prefer that it runs on the eGPU instead? And the process is actually really easy. All you have to do is open up the Applications menu, and then you right-click on the application or the game that you want to run against the eGPU, and then you choose the option right there in that menu to run it against the dedicated GPU, which in this case is referring to the eGPU. However, the ability to be able to right-click on an app and launch using the dedicated GPU is not something that's always going to be available. It's available here for me on the GNOME desktop, but for you, if you're using a different desktop environment, then the process might actually be different. But if your distribution is like GNOME and you have that available there on the right-click menu or something that is named similarly, then you should have everything you need to force an application to run against the eGPU. So what if you're not using GNOME and your desktop environment doesn't have a right-click option like the one you're seeing here? Does that mean you're out of luck and you have to actually install GNOME? Well, no. Actually, there's another way, a workaround, where you can tell an application to run against the eGPU by using the command line. Now, normally in Linux, the command line is not required. So you shouldn't have to do this unless your desktop environment doesn't expose that particular option in the right-click menu. And this process actually consists of using an environment variable that will set some options, and those options are what actually instructs the app to run against the eGPU. The commands that you're going to run are going to be different depending on if you have an Nvidia GPU or an AMD GPU. Anyway, here's the first of the commands that I would like to show you. And this command is specific to external GPUs that have Nvidia GPUs inside. And with this command, we are setting two environment variables. The first one is for GLX applications, and the second one is for Vulkan applications. With this example, we're actually setting both of those environment variables in one command. So that way, regardless of which type of application you are intending to run, then, well, you should be covered. At the end of the command, I have a make-believe path here, but you just change that to the path for whatever the application happens to be, wherever it is on your file system. And then with this command, the application should run against the external GPU. Now, when it comes to AMD GPUs, then this command right here is the one that you should use. As you can see, it's actually a lot simpler. Now keep in mind, if you are using a desktop environment that supports eGPUs, then you shouldn't have to do any of this. But for those of you that are running on a desktop environment that doesn't have this built in a right-click menu or something like that, then these commands right here should get the application running against your external GPU. Now another thing to discuss in this section is the concept of hotplugging, basically the ability to remove an eGPU while your operating system is running without shutting it down first. I mean, that might not seem like a big deal. When you're done using a device, just unplug it, right? I mean, isn't that all you have to do? What's the problem here? Well, keep in mind that eGPUs are actually using PCI Express lanes, so when it comes to the operating system, the process of unplugging your GPU, your external GPU, is exactly the same as opening up a desktop tower and yanking out the GPU right from the slot, which is generally not something that you do, right? I mean, I've never done that, and I don't recommend that you do that either. But even though an eGPU is an external device, the computer itself sees it as a PCI Express device. So by yanking out the cable, again, it's the same as disconnecting a GPU from the inside of a desktop tower, and operating systems generally don't like that kind of thing. Now, don't get me wrong. It is actually possible to be able to hot plug an eGPU and take the cable out without shutting it down. It's just that depending on what your operating system of choice happens to be, you may or may not have issues when you go to try that. Now, each individual operating system might handle this better or worse than others when you compare them, but this is a developing thing and is taking some time to work out. Now, on my end, I actually did disconnect the Thunderbolt cable from my notebook without shutting it down because I wanted to capture a crash in B-roll, but it didn't crash. It was actually completely fine. So your mileage will vary. Now, the fact that I didn't have a problem doesn't mean you won't have a problem. It's a bit hit or miss. And sometimes you could have a problem with hot plugging an eGPU, the first time or not the second time, or it's going to be intermittent. It is what it is. But my inability to create or reproduce this problem doesn't mean there's no problem. It's just that sometimes you'll have a problem with this and sometimes you won't. It's a bit unpredictable. It is what it is. Now, before anybody says that Linux just hasn't caught up with the other operating systems yet, that's not really true. I had a chance to test out this dock right here on a MacBook, and it was infuriating. And what ended up happening is that macOS decided to launch everything against the eGPU. So with macOS, I was forced to go on a scavenger hunt to find all of the apps that were running against the eGPU in order to actually eject it. And it took a very long time, and it was really annoying. So regardless of what your operating system is, there's going to be quirks like this. But until new operating systems and patches come out, the situation is, well, what it is. So what's my verdict on external GPUs? Well, I think eGPUs are awesome. It's a great concept. I mean, imagine having an ultra-portable computer that can double as your gaming desktop. I mean, that's so cool if you think about that possibility. And eGPUs help us achieve that particular goal. Now, on the other hand, external GPUs are chaotic and a bit unpredictable, but hopefully the information that I gave you in this video has helped demystify external GPUs. And if you found it helpful, please consider clicking that like button to let YouTube know that you found this video helpful, which might mean that the algorithm will send this video to other people that might benefit from this knowledge. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video and subscribing to LearnLinuxTV. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys very soon. I have some awesome content coming that I can't wait to show you. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.